Well, thank you all. I learned so much from each of you, and Boyd's perspective, you know, Okinawa roots, and being fed this false native history in California, and then slowly discovering it. It's just a really important story. I do, in the book, I really do emphasize, and there's a wonderful book, I use Jean O'Brien's book, Firsting and Lasting, because she talks about the first, you know, the settlers, the first town, the first township, the first graveyard, the first this and that, the first school, and then the last thing is for the last Indian, the last of the Mohegans, the last Ishi, the last. And it's a really important book because it really brings you into this narrative of this terminal narrative, which Michael Cox at Stanford has a wonderful book that I think he coined that term, the terminal narrative, because this is the trap for analyzing the genocide, is that at least in the United States, I think less so than here probably, most people, I would say overwhelming majority of non-Indigenous people, whether Black, Asian, immigrant, old settler, they believe there are no real Indians left. So therefore there are no Indians left. They were proclaimed the last Indian. There was a statue, there was the Ishi at the turn of the 20th century after the armed resistance was completely wiped out, and all the Native people were in what were really concentration camps at first, with an army base, you know, controlling them. So I really tried to be very careful to constantly emphasize the resistance, because, and I hadn't thought of, boy, gave me a whole new idea how I would rewrite this book, is to go beyond that to what they created. I kind of do at the end. I said this survival is not passive survival, it's active survival. And so the resistance that is created, what, let's say the Sioux, what they consider their heritage, yeah, their old practices and ceremonies, but their basic identity and heritage are, you know, as the war, the resistance led by Crazy Horse. And the American Indian movement, well, its motto is in the spirit of Crazy Horse, also in the spirit of Tecumseh. And the confederations formed and all. So I think we really have to avoid that terminal narrative, because it's all too easy, especially for liberals and leftists, to say, yeah, that's really tragic. I read Howard Zinn's book, and yeah, he kills all the, you know, all the Indians are gone, and he does that in Howard Zinn's book. He then skips, and suddenly they pop up at Alcatraz. That's one of the reasons I wanted to write this book. So, well, what happened to them? Well, they aren't real Indians, you know, they're urban Indians. So that's really a cautionary thing, and I think I could have done better with that. So I thank Boyd for that. Also, I would just mention that Ishi did write a will with Kroger. He created it. And he made Kroger promise that his body would be buried as the traditional, his people's traditional burial. And instead, Kroger was overridden, and Ishi's brain was taken out and pickled, and is still in the attic of Smithsonian Institution. Should be restored. So Victoria said she had to stop reading sometimes, and I had to stop writing a lot. It took me 8 years, you know, to do this book, and I thought it would be easy because it's a synthesis, and I know a lot of the material, like on the Southwest. I've done a whole book on the Southwest. On the Sioux, I've done a whole book. I come from Oklahoma. I I just had to really do a lot of reading for, the colonial period, which I've always avoided in the Northeast because it's such a bunch of lies, worse than anything. And this scalping that Bonita talks about was the hardest thing to deal with because you have to go back to Ireland to see the origin of taking heads and then reducing it to the scalp in the settler colonialism, wars against Ireland. Ireland is conquered. They bring Scots. The Scots were already thrown off their land, the lowland Scots. So they were offered free land to go and take the Irish. So the institutions were all in place for settler colonialism when the British came to North America, including bounties for scalps. So this encourages people to go out and scalp. You can't tell really a child or an old person the scalp is a limited thing, and heads look alike, women, whatever, and not just in war, just to do it on a regular basis. Just go kill an Indian, take a scalp, and this is how people made money at the time. It was lucrative trafficking. So that was very hard to deal with reading some of those documents and testimonies. And back to Victoria, I think she made really good distinctions between U.S. and Canada. I tell you, one of my mentors was a Métis from Saskatchewan, Howard Adams. The late Howard Adams. And he came down to teach at UC Davis after he was kind of toppled as the leader of the Métis organization. And I learned a lot from him about, the colonial structures and all, but he wrote this wonderful memoir history that I always, that it was really a kind of pattern for this, except I didn't bring myself into it as I do these memoirs I wrote. But it's called Prison of Grass. And the subtitle is a Native History of Canada. So in a way that book should be recirculated, because I think he does that. It can be improved upon. It was published in 1975. But it's a good model for Canada. Is my time up?
Almost. Give you a few more seconds.
I want to get to Bonita. I learned so much from Bonita. I did not know about the recognition, but I did, what I have looked at a lot is exactly this, that these wars, like the French and Indian War, they call it in the U.S. textbooks, it was a 7 years war in the continent between France and Britain. And it was fought out here in the colonies, the British and French colonies. And on both sides, there were Indians fighting and getting killed. And that probably has to do with 1761. That was during that French and Indian War. But that was really interesting to me that that was so prevalent here as well. And I think it's just the nature of colonialism in a way. They cannot colonize without in between, what they call in Latin America cacique, is the in between, the native person being a barter person with the colonial system. In India, they set up the whole Raj, of course, for that purpose. And it wasn't settler colonialism. The Raj did all the work. Here it was a little too much. Plus, they had marked this out for settler colonialism. And eventually, slave work, plantation. I think an important difference in Canada from the United States is not that there's not racism here. There's certainly white supremacy just as strong as in the United States. But it goes farther than that in the United States. The colonial system includes slavery. People transported, their land taken away from them and put into slavery, and their bodies bought and sold. this is something not unique to the United States, but it didn't happen in Canada. So
Yeah, it just wasn't plantation.
It wasn't
the what?
commercial. It just wasn't as commercial.
Yeah, no,
It couldn't be a plantation because of the climate. We're the
Right,
only-
right.
only
No,
place that the
exactly.
slavery
No, I'm
was.
not saying that it was the goodness of that.
There
But
was-
it is a different experience. But these loyalists that came over, that was half the population of the 15 colonies were loyalists. Some of them went to Brazil, some of them went to the Caribbean, the ones from the South especially, but most came to Canada. So Canadian history might be very, very different. We don't know, had it not had that force. Okay, and I will just finish with, the Catholic Republic. Yeah, that was the Catholic Republic. That's the French. Thank you.
That's great. I'm going to give my 10 minutes now because we're just about done. First of all, I want to say that citizenship to me is not solved in North America because we're the only people in the world that have our citizenship racialized by someone else. I have white relatives and black relatives in my community, but they are not considered by the state to be citizens, though we consider them citizens. This is one of the ongoing debates that Aboriginal people really haven't had an opportunity to talk about. Some people say Shania Twain is not an Aboriginal person, but she is. She's card carrier. She was adopted by a Anishinaabe when she was 2 years old, and she has Anishinaabe siblings. But in the United States, she's not allowed to say that she's an Anishinaabe until she gets home. She's a relative of my daughter-in-law. These kinds of things that we are either allowed or not allowed to do is part of the continuing containment of Aboriginal people. Someone said to me, well, so-and-so, I think it's Grey Owl wasn't Anishinaabe in any way. And in fact, he's a relation of Armin Garnet Rufo, who's done a book on that. And it's a very painful thing because, of course, he was a bit of a yahoo. He was drunk, We all have drunken relatives. They're embarrassing. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that he was not considered a relative of that family. And that's what we say in our community. Once we bring you in, that's it. We don't care about your color or your heritage. If we were really nations, we would be in the Treaty of the Dish with One Spoon, and you would either be speaking a Haudenosaunee language or Anishinaabe, Anin, Sagoli, you know what I'm saying? You would not be speaking English, and this would not be England, which is what England turned it into, another kind of England. If we're talking about decolonization, we're also talking about that. The only citizenship that is up for grabs is really yours. Y'all consider yourself Canadians, which means villager. I don't know that that's necessarily a country. If you know what I'm saying, it's a village. And we have to reconsider ourselves. All of us have to reconsider ourselves. Where you're standing. Whose law is the law? Whose country is this? It has been said by Canadian law that the government is only in charge of the reservation system. I know in Canada they made the reservations very small, but now it's a big rock on their foot. They don't have any authority over the rest of the country. And that's a big opportunity for Aboriginal people. And I think that books like Roxanne and the other people here help Aboriginal people to take heart again. I know that yours is, be proud of our history, but I'll tell you a little story about that. In my territory of the world, we have these belts. They're Nuu-chah-nulth people, but I'm related to a lot of them through my aunts. And they're all shrunken heads. And when we meet the new teacher, we tell them how much we love our kids, and we all wear these shrunken head belts. So people tend to treat our children nicely after that. I'm not sure I want to return to those kinds of practices. But for sure, we need to consider the territoriality and the nationality and the nature of what actual decolonization involves. And when you see the nature of colonization, and when you really face that this is North America, not Europe, Africa, or Asia, then things change and your perspective changes. And I think that's what all these good people up here are trying to say to you. And thank you very much to Roxanne Dunbar for her latest work. You do it. You took it. I was going to go like this. That was my last thing. You can buy it outside.
We can sign.
And people will sign your books too. And thank you very much.